everybody. My name is Zetta Elliott, and I am the author of Dragons in a Bag and the sequel, The Dragon Thief. And your lovely librarian, Amanda, reached out to me because she said you're all reading Dragons in a Bag together and that some of you had some questions. She sent me your questions, and so I'm going to try to answer them now. The first one is, how do you know how to spell words? That's a really good question. And you know, it's not always easy to spell words the right way. So I often check a dictionary, and I used to have a really big, heavy, thick dictionary, but now I use the dictionaries that are online. So I just look up how to spell different words. Plus, I type my stories. I can type almost 100 words a minute. So I use my laptop, which I'm using right now to film this. I use my laptop to write my stories, and I write in a program called Microsoft Word. And Microsoft Word has a function called spelling and grammar, and it will actually underline words that you have spelled wrong, or grammar that you have gotten wrong as well. So I always know when I've made a mistake, and then I can go and check it. So that's that question. The next one is, what is your favorite book? Whenever someone asks me a question with the word favorite, I get kind of nervous because it means there's one thing that you love better than everything else. And I can't honestly say that about anything other than colors. Purple is my favorite color. But I don't think I could pick one book that's my favorite. I don't have one book that I've read that I love more than every other book, and I don't have a book that I've written that I love more than every other book. But I kind of always remember who and where I was when I read something or when I wrote something. So when I was little, I remember loving Ezra Jack Keats's book, Goggles, because it was set in the city. And it was a group of kids just having fun. They were having an adventure, but they were like playing in a junkyard, which I thought was kind of cool. And then I went to New York when I was about 7 years old, and I kind of saw some empty lots that looked like that. It was kind of like watching Sesame Street. Like, I'd never seen brownstones and stoops until I watched that show. And then I came to Brooklyn, and my cousin lived in a brownstone, and we hung out on her front stoop. So I really loved that book when I was a kid. I also loved, when I got a little bit older, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor, and The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And then when I was a teenager, I really loved reading Charles Dickens stories. You know, he wrote A Christmas Carol, and some really long novels, which I like to read. And then I read a book called Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid and Beloved by Toni Morrison. I read those two books the same semester of my last year of college, and that kind of changed the course of my life because those stories meant so much to me that I wanted to read more and more things by Black women. So I applied to graduate school, and I moved to New York City. Let's see, the next question, why is Ambrose invisible? That's a good question. So, you know, I used to live in Brooklyn. I lived there for 20 years. Now I live in Illinois. But when I lived in Brooklyn, I would often see homeless people, and sometimes they were on a bench, sitting or sleeping, and sometimes they had grocery carts, and they would put all of the things that mattered to them in their grocery cart and push it along because they didn't have a home. They were unhoused, and I didn't think it was right that there were so many homeless people in New York City, in our country generally, when we are such a wealthy country. But it also bothered me that people would just walk by. And, you know, once in a while someone might offer some spare change or something to eat. But a lot of times I think homeless people were just invisible in our community, and I didn't think that that was right. And I felt like everyone has a story to tell, including homeless people. And if we gave them the opportunity to tell their story, who knows what we might discover. And all of those people, if they were given a home, you know, would be able to contribute more to our community. So I wanted Ambrose to be someone who was important, right? He had to give the password in order for the gatehouse, the guardhouse to work, the portal to open. And I wanted him to sort of represent a person that Jax might have just walked by and not noticed and not realized how important he was. So that's why I decided to make Ambrose invisible. What is the hardest thing about writing a book? I have 3 books due this month. And I did finish them last fall, but now my editors have read them and they've sent me revisions. That's when they read your story and they say, oh, I love this and I love this and I love this, but I think it would be better if you change this and change that, and could you add this, and what if we tried, they give you a whole bunch of suggestions, and then you have to go back and decide which suggestions you want to keep and which ones you don't. So I think revising is hard. Writing the books I don't find to be that hard, because writing for me is 70% dreaming. So that means I spend a lot of time in my head with my characters, listening to their voices, listening to them have conversations with each other. And then because I can type very quickly, writing itself isn't that hard. Sometimes meeting deadlines can be challenging. I was 2 weeks late turning in book 3 in the Dragon series, The Witch's Apprentice. I think I'm probably going to have to say the hardest thing about being an author is actually getting published. So quite often I write things and I send them to an editor, and the editor doesn't give me a thumbs up, they give me a thumbs down, and then, they don't want my book. So I have learned how to make my own books, and that's really fun. And I just finished a book last week called Roots Run Deep. It's a picture book. So I like making my own books. And so, whenever there's a challenge, there's usually a way around it. Revising isn't fun, but at least you know that you're making your book a better story. Let's see. How many Dragons in a Bag books are there going to be? Oh, in my mind, there are 5. Dragons in a Bag, The Dragon Thief, The Witch's Apprentice, which I am working on the revisions now this month. The 4th book is called The Enchanted Bridge, and the 5th book is called The War of the Witches. So my publisher said yes to books 1 and 2, and then they said no to book 3, which was disappointing. And then we had protests this past year, right? In 2020, there were a lot of protests. A lot of Black and white people, all kinds of people went out in the street to argue that we ought to have no police brutality and that everybody should have equal rights. And a lot of publishing companies decided to take a look at how they had been treating their Black authors, if they had any Black authors. And so they came back to me and said, well, how about we do book 3? And I said, how about we do book 3, 4, and 5? And they agreed to do books 3 and 4. So we have a thumbs up for books 3 and 4, and no thumbs up yet for book 5. But hopefully I'll get a thumbs up, and if I don't, I'll make that book myself. Who is your favorite character in the book? So again, I don't have favorites. That's really hard because, I put a little bit of myself in all of my characters. And Kavi, Vikram's little sister, I named her after a friend of mine, Kavita, and she died of cancer. So I really like to be able to say her name all the time whenever I'm talking about those books. And she's feisty and she doesn't like being underestimated. And I really identify with Kenny, who's in the 2nd book, because, he was really close to his dad, and then his parents got divorced and his dad moved out and started a new family. And I know what that feels like because that happened when I was young too. And I guess I like Ma. She's kind of cranky, and I think maybe I'm kind of cranky too sometimes. So yeah, I don't have a favorite character, but I like all of them, and there's a little bit of me in all the characters. And when you get to book 3, The Witch's Apprentice, I think definitely my favorite new character is Quaisha, and she's a lot of fun, so I hope you like her too when we get there. What is your favorite animal? That's hard. I love having pets. Like I had fish and I had a bird. We had canaries and kittens, and my sister had a dog. And I am allergic to animals. So unfortunately, I don't have any pets right now because it's just too difficult. I have asthma too. So I don't have any animals in my home. I do love otters. I have to say that anytime I'm online and I see a video of an otter, I always stop to watch it because they make me so happy. And I think I love the fact that otters, sea otters, they float on their backs and they can hold their baby otters on their back, on their belly as well. And they also hold hands when they're floating with their mate. I think that's really nice so they don't drift apart. and they can like juggle rocks, and I think they're pretty awesome. They look like they have a lot of fun because, river otters are always like sliding down banks and stuff. So yeah, I think I would say otters. Not my favorite, but definitely an animal I like a lot. What do you use to write with? Yeah, so when I'm ready to write, after I have done all that dreaming, I sit down and I use my computer and my laptop. And I start out in my office. I have an office, but then I usually move to the living room, which is where I am right now. And I don't know if you can see, there's like a purple couch there with a cushion that's for my back so that I have good posture while I'm writing. And I have lots of light in this room, which is good. And it's really quiet in my neighborhood and in my building, which also helps a lot. Sometimes I do take notes by hand, but I am left-handed. And I find that my writing is really messy, and I can't write fast enough to get all my thoughts out. And then I end up with ink all smudged down my hand and smudged on the page. So I do sometimes make notes by hand, and I definitely type an outline. I definitely make like 10 points of this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And I make a cast so I know all of the names of my characters and about how old they are and what makes them special or unique. So I do all of that. And then once you start writing, or for me, typing, your story might change as you go along. So my outline does sometimes change. For this latest book, The Witch's Apprentice, I started off with 10 chapters, and then I realized my chapters were way too long. So I split some of them in half, and that meant I had 14 chapters. And then, the first book, Dragons in a Bag, that book is about 25,000 words. Yeah. And then the next book was 32,000 words. But this third book is 50,000 words. And so my editor, she thinks maybe it's too long. Maybe kids don't want to read that long. I think kids can read that long. So I'm going to try to actually make it maybe a little bit longer to change the ending. But yeah, that's more about my writing process. How old were you when you started writing books? Well, I was a storyteller from a very early age, like preschool. I loved to tell stories to other kids. I was the youngest in my family, and so my older brother and sister, they didn't have time for me. They didn't want to listen to me, but if I told a good story, other people would listen to me, other kids. So I learned early on that it was a good idea to be a storyteller if you wanted to have an audience. And then I wrote stories for school because, you have English language arts class. But I didn't start writing out of school until I was in high school. And in grade 9, I had an English teacher named Nancy Vickert, and she took me aside and said, if you want to be a writer, Zetta Elliott, you will be. And I didn't know, you just had to decide. And she said, well, you don't just decide, you have to write every day. So at that point, I started writing every day, even at home. And the first novel I tried to write was so terrible, I was writing it by hand, that I threw it out. But everything else I wrote, I kept, and I put it on my computer and saved it and printed out a copy. And sometimes I would share it with people, and sometimes I wouldn't. So I think probably when I was a teenager, 13, 14, 15 is when I started to first write books, but I didn't get published. I didn't have a book published until 2008. So I would have been 26. 36 at that point. Yeah, it took a really long time. Let's see. How long does it take you to write a book? Depends on the kind of book. So picture books, I have a picture book due on Monday, and I wrote it last summer. It's called Juneteenth, which is a holiday. It celebrates African Americans in Texas finding out in 1865 that slavery had been over for 2 years. So that poem, I think I started that poem and then I stopped, and then I went back a couple weeks later and I finished it. Maybe it took me a few hours to write that poem, maybe 6 or 7 hours. And then I realized it would make a really good picture book, so I sent it to my agent, and she sent it to an editor who gave us the thumbs up. So now it's going to be a picture book with pictures, lovely illustrations. So picture books don't take very long, but novels can take a lot longer. I think I wrote Dragons in a Bag in about 6 weeks. And The Dragon Thief took me about that same amount of time, maybe a little bit longer. And The Witch's Apprentice, I would say, took me maybe 2.5 months. That sounds about right, because I had to move to Chicago because it's set here in Chicago, and I had to do research, and it's the pandemic. There are so many things that are closed and it's hard to travel, and so the longest it ever took me to finish a book was 12 years. And that's a novel for teenagers called The Door at the Crossroads. And it's a sequel to my time travel novel, A Wish After Midnight. So I wrote A Wish After Midnight, and as soon as I finished it, I immediately started writing The Door at the Crossroads. And then my dad got sick. He had cancer, and I had to take care of him. So I put the book aside, and I did other things, and then I went to Africa for a while, and then I wrote a memoir, and then I wrote some plays, and then I wrote some other books, and it just took me a really long time to get back to doing research and finishing The Door at the Crossroads. So stories, they sort of have their own timeline. I wrote a play. I wrote a collection of poems called Say Her Name. That came out last year. And then a theater producer reached out and said, what if we made that into a play? So I rewrote it as a play, and that took me about 5 days. And that doesn't mean I'm sitting at my desk from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m, but when I start a project, I try to stay focused on it. When I'm trying to finish a novel, I usually set a quota, a number of words. I try to write 1,000 words a day. And sometimes I write 2,000 or 3,000 words a day, and sometimes I only write 200 or 300 words a day. So sometimes you can just push yourself and get it done, and other days you just have to cut yourself some slack and say, well, I tried. So yesterday I was supposed to turn in 10 poems to my editor, and I did not have 10 poems done. So I am on poem number 7 right now, and I might send her those, and then try to finish the other 3 tomorrow. But then I have that other book due Monday, and then I have more revisions due the week after that. So being a writer sometimes means you have to juggle, right? You have to find the balance between how much time you spend dreaming, and I try to take a walk every day, and I got a treadmill so I can run on my treadmill, get some exercise. I find being in nature helps a lot with my imagination, and now I live right next to or close to Lake Michigan, so it's really nice to be able to walk along the lake, and the water I find is really soothing. We don't get a whole lot of sun in the wintertime, but when there is sunshine, I try to go outside, and I saw a woodpecker yesterday and a cardinal the day before. I love seeing birds, and winter's a good time to look at birds. I've seen a hawk before, so somehow seeing other creatures in nature, I don't know, it sort of makes me dreamy, and then I start thinking about ideas, and right now I'm writing about a kid who's growing up in Brooklyn in 1982, and I was a kid in the 1980s, so I'm writing about movies like Superman 2 and E.T. and Indiana Jones, so it's making me remember a lot of things from my childhood, which I like to do. So writing usually means you have to turn inward, and reflect on things and imagine things. And then it's time to open your eyes and turn outward and write them all down. So that's what I do with my dragon stories, with all my stories and my poems and my plays. So I hope I have answered all of your questions, and I hope you enjoy reading Dragons in a Bag. And maybe if you enjoy reading that book, you will consider reading the sequel, The Dragon Thief. And then next year, hopefully February, January of next year, The Witch's Apprentice will be out as well, and you can read that. And then The Enchanted Bridge, and I will find a way to do The War of the Witches also. And if you also like fantasy stories, I have other books about unicorns and phoenixes, lots of other things, ghost stories if you like those. So you can check those out on my website. And if you have other questions, you can reach out to me on social media. And I thank you again, everybody at the Pflugerville, I hope I said that right, Public Library in Texas. Stay safe. We're going to get through this, the pandemic. We're almost there. We've already done it for almost a year, and we can just keep going a little bit farther. And we're going to keep each other safe. And yet we're going to stay connected by reading, because that's what stories do. They bring us together. So take care. And thanks again for reading my book.